Today, the story I'm going to tell you is about a prisoner who neither broke out of any jail nor robbed anyone. Instead, this prisoner did something inside the jail that no one could believe after seeing it with their own eyes. This story is very strange and unbelievable in itself, and if some police officers hadn't kept a record of this incident, no one would have believed it. Around 4 police officers and 1 jail warden were eyewitnesses to this incident. And when they told people about what the prisoner had done, everyone was left stunned because it was beyond human power. And as soon as this came to light, the entire Pennsylvania was shaken with fear. So, who was this prisoner? And what did he do that human eyes couldn't believe? And how did this secret come in front of the world? After knowing this, you'll be forced to think, can something like this really happen? The story begins on February 24th, 1983, when 21-year-old Don Decker enters a funeral room. This funeral room was in a small town called Stroudsburg in Pennsylvania, and Don Decker had come here because his grandfather's last rites were being performed, and before burying him, his friends and relatives were being shown his face for the last time. Anyway, as soon as Don enters the funeral room, he sees his grandfather's body placed in a coffin, and the lid of the coffin is open. His family members, his grandfather's friends, and many relatives were sitting on their knees, looking at his face one last time. The funeral room was completely filled with people. Everyone was crying and consoling each other. But after entering, Don neither speaks to his family or friends, nor does he go near his grandfather's coffin. He directly goes to the last row of the room and sits on a seat. There's a lot of anger on Don's face at that moment, and he started angrily looking at the people around him. There was no sadness or regret on his face over his grandfather's death. He was so furious that he clenched his fists so tightly that his nails began cutting into his own skin. Don had come straight to the funeral from Monroe County Jail, where he was serving a sentence of a few months for a theft charge. And since his grandfather had passed away, the jail had given him permission to go on parole for 2 days. After attending the funeral, he had to return to jail. Anyway, by now the funeral had begun, and Don's family members were coming up one by one to the mic and saying some good things about his grandfather. At that moment, Don starts regretting coming here because he couldn't bear to hear what people were saying about his grandfather. To distract himself from the speeches, Don starts looking around. And then suddenly, his eyes get fixed on his grandfather's coffin. He keeps staring at his grandfather's face. As he was staring, he suddenly sees something that makes him immediately stand up from his seat. Seeing this, everyone in the funeral room, including the cousin who was giving a speech on the mic, turns their attention toward Don. They couldn't understand why Don had suddenly stood up. Now everyone was looking at Don, and Don knew this, but his eyes and full attention were still fixed on his grandfather's body. The reason Don was shocked was because just a few seconds ago, he had seen his grandfather's lips move. But when Don kept staring at his lips hoping they would move again, nothing happened. Anyway, Don remains quiet and, without saying anything to the people staring at him, walks out of the funeral room. After coming outside, at first he thinks he should go home, where all the family members are going to gather after the funeral. But since Don didn't want to stay around his family, he decides to go to a friend's house, a couple named Bob and Jeannie. Don decided to go to their place because he knew he could chill with them, and they wouldn't ask too many questions. He could peacefully spend the 2 days there. Don wanted to make these 2 days of leave memorable. He just wanted to spend them peacefully and calmly. So, he heads straight to Bob and Jeannie's house. Seeing Don outside their house, Bob and Jeannie become very happy. They welcome him inside and tell him to freshen up, and then they'll have dinner together. Don nods silently and enters the house, heading straight upstairs to the bathroom. As soon as he reaches the bathroom, he starts splashing cold water on his face. But the anger and anxiety he felt at the funeral room still weren't going away. Anyway, after splashing water on his face 4 or 5 times, he starts feeling a bit better, because now his body was gradually cooling down and his anger was also calming. At first, Don was feeling better and the cold felt normal, but suddenly the cold started increasing rapidly. And strange things started happening inside that bathroom. Don suddenly felt as if snow was falling all over the bathroom, and he began to shiver from extreme cold. And then suddenly, as he raises his eyes and looks in the mirror, his soul trembles. In the mirror, Don sees an old man standing behind him, wearing a golden crown on his head. Frightened, Don quickly turns around, but no one is there. Still shivering, he looks around the entire bathroom, but he doesn't see the old man anywhere. Seeing this, Don becomes very scared, and he can't understand why the bathroom is so cold and what he just saw in the mirror. In the meantime, Don notices his wrist and sees that there are deep scratches on it. Seeing this, he becomes very scared and quickly pulls down both his sleeves to cover his wrists. He immediately turns off the water and comes out of the bathroom, heading quickly downstairs, where Bob and Jeannie were waiting for him at the dinner table. Anyway, sitting at the table, he quietly starts eating his dinner and doesn't tell Bob and Jeannie anything about what had happened to him in the bathroom. Now, by looking at Don, Bob and Jeannie clearly understood that something was going on in his mind. But since they had known him for years, they knew Don was a quiet person who didn't share his personal things with others. So, they didn't find it too strange. Although whenever he spoke, it was very little and usually about sad things. He had never hurt anyone and was a good person. So Bob and Jeannie, without asking anything, continue eating their dinner, but they kept glancing at Don repeatedly. After dinner, Jeannie picks up the dishes and goes to the kitchen, and Bob and Don sit in the living room to watch TV. They had just been watching TV for a little while when suddenly Bob looks at Don and sees that instead of watching TV, Don is staring at the floor. Bob sees that Don is sitting completely still, frozen in one spot, and he was staring continuously at the ground without moving. And seeing this, Bob started feeling that he was in deep shock because of his grandfather's death, and he couldn't understand what to say to Don. Nevertheless, Bob kept sitting there silently, thinking that his presence might comfort Don, and he lowered the TV volume and started watching it. Only a few minutes had passed in this silence when Bob suddenly started hearing the sound of water flowing, and he first looked at Don because he thought maybe Don had spilled water on the ground. But nothing like that had happened. Don was still sitting in one place, staring continuously at the ground. But the sound of water was still coming, and seeing this, Bob looked toward the kitchen, thinking maybe Jeannie was washing the dishes after dinner, but nothing like that was happening there either. Bob was still trying to understand where this sound of water was coming from when suddenly a drop of water fell on his head. And as soon as he looked up, he saw that water was dripping from the ceiling. Seeing this, he immediately stood up and shouted to his wife Jeannie that a pipe had burst. And at the same time, he also called his landlord because his landlord lived nearby. He told him on the phone that a pipe had burst in his house and he should come over quickly. Within just 5 minutes, the landlord and his wife arrived there, and Bob and the landlord ran toward the upper part of the house to find out where the water was coming from. After reaching upstairs, they checked every bathroom, washroom, and pipe, but they didn't find any place from where the water could be leaking, and they didn't even hear the sound of flowing water. They even went and stood near the part of the house that was above the living room, where the water was leaking downstairs into the living room. But their surprise knew no bounds when they found out that there were neither any pipes there nor any plumbing work done. That area was completely dry, and not even a drop of water was there. Seeing this, Bob and the landlord got caught in a great dilemma about where this water was coming from. Nevertheless, both of them started coming downstairs, thinking about what to do next. And as soon as they both reached downstairs, two very strange things suddenly happened. The first thing was that as soon as they entered the living room where the water was leaking, they saw that the leakage had increased significantly, and now water was dripping not just from the ceiling, but also from the walls. Now water was flowing from the ceiling and every wall of the living room, and it kept increasing. And the second strange thing that caught their attention was Don. Don was still sitting on the sofa, and there was no movement in his body, and he was continuously staring at the ground. Seeing this seemed very odd to them because the entire living room was dripping with water from every side, but Don hadn't moved an inch from his place. Seeing this, Bob started worrying about Don and immediately went to him and asked if he was okay. But Don didn't respond to his question. And then suddenly, Don's face began to twist in a very strange way, and a very weird and scary smile appeared on his face. Now, as that strange smile on Don's face grew, his fingers also began to bend in odd ways. Seeing this, Bob realized that something was definitely wrong with Don, and he should call the police. Nevertheless, he immediately called the police, and in just a little while, 2 police officers, John Bowes and Richard Walbert, arrived at Bob's house. As soon as both police officers entered the house, Bob began to tell them everything about the situation. And as soon as both police officers entered the living room, they were shocked because they were now standing in a room where water was coming not only from the ceiling and the walls, but also from the floor of the living room. Seeing this, both police officers were baffled, trying to understand what was going on. And then their eyes fell on Don, who was still sitting on the sofa. Despite all the water everywhere, he was sitting in one place, with a strange smile on his face, moving his twisted fingers on the table. Seeing this, both police officers became very nervous and told Bob that they couldn't understand what was happening and how to help him. And to understand this matter, they would have to call their police chief. So both police officers left, and now Bob, Jeannie, the landlord, and his wife, all 4 of them started feeling scared in that house because of Don's strange smile, his twisted fingers, and the water coming out from everywhere. Their dining room was right in front of the living room, so the 4 of them sat in the dining room and kept looking at Don sitting in the living room. During this time, both police officers returned with their police chief. When the police chief entered, he too witnessed the same strange scene. But instead of panicking or getting scared, he told Bob and the landlord that this wasn't a police problem and that they should call a plumber as soon as possible and fix their pipeline. As for Don, he said that Don was just behaving strangely and that he was completely fine. The police chief also told both officers, John and Richard, that whatever they had seen in this house, they should not tell anyone about it and should leave the house immediately and not file any report about this matter. After saying this, the police chief took both officers with him and left. After that, Bob and Jeannie couldn't understand what to do, and they kept looking from the dining room at Don sitting in the living room, who was still moving his twisted fingers on the table. During this time, they had already called the plumber, and just a little while later, the plumber arrived at their house. But when the plumber checked every corner of the house for the leakage, he didn't find any leak. Even the plumber couldn't believe where the water was leaking from. Finally, tired, Bob asked the landlord what he should do. To this, the landlord replied that he too didn't understand anything and that he would send some more people tomorrow to check the place. To spend the night, Bob and Jeannie laid towels and blankets all over the living room to soak the water. During all this, they kept looking again and again at Don, who was sitting on the sofa, moving his fingers on the table. Finally, after laying towels and blankets all over the living room, they ran out of them too. But the water still wouldn't stop leaking, and they couldn't understand what was happening to Don either. Now, they were just waiting for Don to say something. But instead of speaking or talking to them, Don sat on the sofa, closed his eyes, and tilted his head to one side. Seeing this, Bob got scared and immediately went to Don to check if he was breathing and if he was okay. Upon checking, Bob found that Don was fine. But then his eyes fell on something that left him completely shocked. Bob saw deep red scratch marks on Don's neck, and it looked like someone had tried to strangle him very forcefully. And inside the collar of his shirt, there was also blood. Terrified, Bob immediately called Jeannie and asked her what was happening, to which Jeannie replied that she was now very scared and had no idea what was going on. Nevertheless, the 2 of them, husband and wife, decided that now they will go to bed and sleep because Don was now lying on the sofa with his eyes closed, and they could not stop the flowing water and started waiting for the next morning. Anyway, the next morning when both of them came down from their bedroom, they saw that water was still leaking all over the living room, and Don was again sitting on the sofa with his same strange smile and crooked fingers. Now Don stayed sitting on the sofa in the same condition the whole day and the next day as well, and during this time different plumbers kept coming to try to find this leakage, but no one could understand where this leakage was coming from. Now, because of this flowing water, the living room was turning into a pool, and then came February 26th. The day Don had to return to jail. That day, Don suddenly got up from the sofa and left Bob and Jeannie's house without saying anything. And after he left, a very surprising thing happened that shocked Bob and Jeannie. They both saw that as soon as Don left the house, all the water that was leaking from the ceiling and walls suddenly stopped leaking. Bellal Don reached back to jail and went inside his cell. And as soon as he entered his cellmate's eyes directly fell on Don's face, which was smiling with a twisted face and neck. Seeing this, his cellmate felt very strange because Don's face looked very scary, and he immediately called a guard saying that Don should be taken out of the cell as he could not stay with him. Hearing this, the guard also looked at Don's face, and both saw that Don had the same scary smile and expression on his face which he had during his stay at Bob and Jeannie's house. Now Don tilted his neck to one side and, smiling in a scary voice, said, "I can make it rain." Seeing this, the second inmate started shouting that let him out of the cell. But instead of being scared, he started thinking about what Don had said and what he meant by that. He then told Don that if he really could make it rain, then he should do it inside the warden's office. As the guard said this, the smile on Don's face became even more terrifying, and because of this smile, his teeth were also visible. Seeing this, the guard started to get scared, and he understood why the second inmate was afraid of Don, and he ran straight to the warden's office to tell the warden about Don. The warden's name was Dave Kinhold, and as soon as the guard entered the warden's office, he saw something very strange. The guard saw that the warden was sitting at his table doing some work, and suddenly he noticed a wet mark on the warden's shirt that was slowly spreading all over the shirt, and the warden was completely unaware of it. Seeing the guard, the warden asked what work he had come for, and the guard immediately shouted, pointing at the warden's shirt, "What is happening?" As the warden looked down and saw his shirt, he was shocked, and during this time the guard told him about Don and the rainmaking thing. Looking at this wet mark, neither of them could understand what was going on, so both immediately ran towards Don's cell. When they reached there, the sight they saw was impossible for anyone to believe. They both saw that water was leaking from the ceiling, walls, and floor everywhere in the cell, and even from the bars of the cell. Inside this cell, Don was standing with his strange smile and crooked hands, and the other inmate was sitting in a corner crying out of fear. Seeing this, the warden took that inmate out of the cell and shifted him to another cell, then locked the cell and called a plumber to come and check where the water was leaking from. Anyway, after reaching the jail, the plumber checked every corner of the cell and the jail, but he could neither find any such place nor understand where this water was leaking from. During this time, even the plumber was completely scared seeing Don and quickly checked the jail and cell and left without taking any money. The warden still couldn't understand what was happening with Don, but at the same time, he knew this was beyond his limits, and he didn't know whom to call for help. Anyway, he called the jailer and told him to understand this matter. And when the jailer saw Don and the water-filled cell, at first he couldn't understand anything, but when he went closer to Don, Don also started moving towards him. After taking 3 or 4 steps, Don suddenly stopped, and the jailer's steps also stopped, and they both started looking at each other. The jailer saw that Don raised his hands in the air, and as soon as he raised his hands, even more water started coming out from all over the cell, walls, and ceiling, which made the ground beneath the jailer and guard slip away. Along with the water, a very strange bad smell started spreading all over the jail, as if some dead body was rotting. The jailer and guard were watching this whole scene when suddenly Don put his hand down and started rubbing both his palms. Seeing this, the jailer immediately understood that some demonic force had possessed Don. The jailer ran and brought a Bible from his room and started loudly reading Bible passages in front of Don to drive away the spirit that was controlling him. During this time, Don suddenly let out a very loud and very scary scream, so loud that the jailer, guards, and warden all had to cover their ears. Then suddenly Don fell on the ground and started crying. After this incident, it took Don a long time to explain what happened that night inside Bob's house in the jail cell. And when this story came out in front of people, they were shocked. Don first told his friend Bob and Jeannie the complete truth, in which he narrated everything that happened with him between February 24th and 26th. Don told them that he and his grandfather were very close, which was why he often stayed with his grandfather, but since he was 7 years old, his grandfather started physically abusing him. He took a sigh of relief, but when he saw his relatives speaking good things about his grandfather at the funeral, his blood boiled, and his anger was becoming unbearable. During this time, he saw his grandfather's lips moving, And at that moment, he did not understand what it meant, but Don believes that it was at that moment that his grandfather's evil spirit possessed him completely. Don also said that the night when he went to Bob and Jeannie's house, he started feeling that something was wrong with him, but he couldn't stop it. He felt like someone had taken control over his mind and heart and was making him do everything he did not want to do, but he could not stop himself. During this time, when he went to wash his hands and face in Bob's house bathroom, he saw the face of an old man in the mirror who was none other than his grandfather wearing a crown on his head. Don said that his grandfather's crown meant that he was fully controlling Don, and the scratch marks on his palm were also made by his grandfather. Don said that at first he thought it was his imagination, so he didn't tell anyone at the dinner table, but after dinner when he was sitting on the sofa in the living room, he started feeling that his grandfather had completely taken control of him. That was the reason why he stayed sitting on the sofa with a strange smile and crooked fingers, and all the water leaking throughout the living room was also being controlled by his grandfather. They wanted to scare Don and his friends. And when the same thing happened in jail, he became sure that his grandfather wanted to put him and his friends into more trouble. Even after 10 years of this incident, those who saw everything never spoke publicly about it, especially the jailer and guards. They also never told anyone because they believed that if they revealed this, everyone would think they were crazy and they would lose their jobs. Anyway, in the 1990s, 5 people, including 4 police officers and 1 warden, officially testified in front of everyone about what they saw in Don's strange condition in the jail cell that night. They also told that water was leaking from every wall, ceiling, floor, and even from the bars of the cell. Even today, no one has a proper answer about what happened to Don during those 2 days, and everyone believes that Don was possessed by the evil spirit of his grandfather. One thing caught everyone's attention more, and that was that after those 2 days, Don never made it rain again and now lives a normal life. But later, this incident became so famous that Don's name was recorded in history as Rain Man. How did you like this story? Do write in the comment section, and don't forget to like and subscribe the channel.